Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Luke Johnson from Noetic, the Humanities Teaching app. Go download it for your iPhone and Android devices. You can also catch us streaming on YouTube. Today, Jennifer Avery is going to talk to us about Pride and Prejudice. I believe this is our 9th installment. We had a bit of a hiatus. Is it right? Is it our 9th installment?
Something around in there, I think. Maybe 9 or 10. I can't remember.
So what are you going to try to cover today?
Okay, well, I'm just going to cover this short little piece while Lizzie is in Kent visiting Charlotte and Mr. Collins. And in the previous chapters, she kind of set up this new surrounding, and we've kind of had it. It's kind of been confirmed to Elizabeth that Lady Catherine de Bourgh is exactly the kind of woman that she thought she was going to be. And Charlotte is pretty happy and has made the most of her situation being married to Mr. Collins, even though Elizabeth is pretty sure that Mr. Collins gets on her nerves. But she's making the most of it. And so in chapter 7, Sir William Lucas came with Lizzie and Charlotte's sister Maria, or Mariah as they would have said back then. So Sir William only stayed a week, and this happened fairly regularly back in those days. Like a man would join them for maybe a week, but the ladies would stay for an extended period of time with their friend or family member. And this was viewed as a way for the lady to meet new people and perhaps even find a husband. And that was not the sole purpose of these visits, but it was the main purpose of these visits, because otherwise a lady never left home. And so friends and family would often invite them out to another part of the country where they would spend a great deal of time. And so Sir William only stayed a week, and now he's gone off. And fortunately for them, Mr. Collins continues to kind of make himself scarce around the house, because he works in his garden and he has to walk to Lady Catherine's house at least once a day. And the ladies spend their time in a room that Elizabeth is a little bit confused by. Like the room, most of the time during this time in history in England, the women, the family had certain rooms that they used for certain reasons. Like a parlor was where the ladies would spend most of their day. Like they'd be working on their needlework, or they'd be reading or doing something like that. And it depended on the time of day, which room they would stay in. Like if during the summer, if the room is facing the sun, then they don't stay in that room all day. They move so it's not as hot and it's not as bright. But in any case, Elizabeth is a little bit confused at first that Charlotte doesn't stay in a bigger room with a nicer view. But when she realizes that Mr. Collins would have to go through there and would probably spend more time with them if she stayed in this room, Elizabeth understands. She's trying to stay away from Mr. Collins, essentially. Charlotte is trying to keep away from her husband so she doesn't have to spend too much time with him. And so Lizzie gets it. And so Mr. Collins spends his days going to Rosen's and in the garden, and a lot of times Charlotte goes with Mr. Collins when he goes to Rosings, to Lady Catherine de Bourgh's house. And so Elizabeth really has a lot of time to herself, and she likes to spend this time walking outside. Lizzie is an outdoorsy kind of girl, and she likes taking long walks, and she likes being out in the woods. And so she finds herself, she's kind of found a favorite spot along an orchard in a lane. And they spend a lot of time with Lady Catherine, of course, and and it's pretty funny. Now and then they were honored with a call from her ladyship, and nothing escaped her observation that was passing in the room during these visits. She examined into their employments, looked at their work, and advised them to do it differently, found fault with the arrangement of the furniture, or detected the housemaid in negligence, and if she accepted any refreshment, seemed to do it only for the sake of finding out that Mrs. Collins's joints of meat were too large for her family. Elizabeth soon perceived that though this great lady was not in the commission of the peace for the country, which means that she wasn't in charge of that area, she was a most active magistrate in her own parish, the minutest concerns of which were carried to her by Mr. Collins, and whenever any of the cottagers were disposed to be quarrelsome, discontented, or too poor, she sallied forth into the village to settle their differences, silence their complaints, and scold them into harmony and plenty. So essentially, Lady Catherine is extremely all up in everybody's business in her area. All of the people who live near her are subjected to her opinions on everything, down to how big a piece of meat gets ordered for the family. And poor Charlotte has to receive the brunt of it because Mr. Collins is kind of kind of the main beneficiary now. So Lady Catherine is extremely officious, in other words. And so we get this little sketch of how life goes on in Kent while Lizzie's there. And they go to Rosings at least twice a week, and it's pretty much the same as the first description of it. And then they find out pretty soon afterwards that Mr. Darcy's coming to town. Now remember that Mr. Darcy is Lady Catherine's nephew. His mother was Lady Catherine's sister. And remember, too, that Lady Catherine's daughter, Miss Anne de Bourgh, is supposedly promised to Mr. Darcy. And so so Elizabeth's looking forward to seeing how all this plays out. She's actually, it's just kind of out of, those memes of like Michael Jackson eating popcorn when you have a lot of comments? That's Elizabeth, wanting to see what happens with Mr. Darcy and Miss Anne de Bourgh. She just wants to see what happens. And so he soon shows up, and oddly enough, Mr. Darcy comes along with his cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam, to visit the parsonage, which is actually, he visits pretty soon after they arrive, which is kind of unusual. And Charlotte acknowledges this, and she says, "I may thank you, Eliza, for this piece of civility. Mr. Darcy would never have come so soon to wait upon me." Elizabeth had scarcely time to disclaim all right to the compliment before their approach was announced by the doorbell, and shortly afterwards the three gentlemen entered the room. Colonel Fitzwilliam, who led the way, was about 30, not handsome, but in person and address most truly the gentleman. Mr. Darcy looked just as he had been used to look in Hertfordshire, paid his compliments with his usual reserve to Mrs. Collins, and whatever might be his feelings toward her friend, met her with every appearance of composure, as Elizabeth merely curtsied to him without saying a word. And pretty quickly we find out that Colonel Fitzwilliam is a pretty nice guy, and he takes a shine to Lizzie almost right away. And Lizzie likes him because he talks easily, and he's not, he always has something to say, and he's very gentlemanly and kind. And she talks to Colonel Fitzwilliam for a while Mr. Darcy's sitting there being all silent and proud. And finally, Mr. Darcy decides he ought to say something and asks her about her family. And then she poses the question, my eldest sister has been in town these 3 months. Have you never happened to see her there? She was perfectly sensible that he never had, but she wished to see whether he would betray any consciousness of what had passed between the Bingleys and Jane. And she thought he looked a little confused as he answered that he had never been so fortunate as to meet Miss Bennet. The subject was pursued no farther, and the gentleman soon afterwards went away. So Lizzie kind of tries to test him, because remember, she thinks that Miss Bingley, along with Mr. Darcy, kind of separated Mr. Bingley from Jane. And so she's kind of trying to find out a little bit more, but Mr. Darcy doesn't do much to help her with that. Alright, so that's the end of chapter 7. And chapter 8, we find out that Colonel Fitzwilliam comes to the parsonage pretty often to talk to Lizzie and to talk to Charlotte. And here's a nice little paragraph here. Colonel Fitzwilliam seemed really glad to see them. Anything was a welcome relief to him at Rosings. And Mrs. Collins's pretty friend had, moreover, caught his fancy very much. He now seated himself by her, and talked so agreeably of Kent and Hertfordshire, of travelling and staying at home, of new books and music, that Elizabeth had never been half so well entertained in that room before. So they're at Rosings right now. And they conversed with so much spirit and flow as to draw the attention of Lady Catherine herself, as well as of Mr. Darcy. His eyes had been soon and repeatedly turned towards them with a look of curiosity, and that her ladyship, after a while, shared the feeling, was more openly acknowledged, for she did not scruple to call out, "What is it that you are saying, Fitzwilliam? What is it you are talking of? What are you telling Miss Bennet? Let me hear what it is." "We are speaking of music, madam," said he, when no longer able to avoid a reply. So Colonel Fitzwilliam and Lizzie get along so well that Darcy notices it, and Lady Catherine notices it. And Lady Catherine's got to put in her 2 cents. She wants to know everything that's going on, and so she kind of calls out and demands to know what they're talking about. And when Colonel Fitzwilliam tells her that they're talking about music, Lady Catherine's reply is, "Oh, I love to talk about music, but I don't know anything about it, but I know if I did, I would be a good musician." So basically, she likes to brag about things that she doesn't even do. What she's doing is brag about a potential that we don't even know is there. And she does it on behalf of her daughter, too. So you see this character of Lady Catherine feels like she's superior in every way. Even in things that she doesn't know how to do. She's not a musician. She doesn't play the piano. But she says, if I had, then I would be really good at it. You see how uppity this lady is. And she says the same thing about Miss Anne de Bourgh. And Lady Catherine then changes the subject, and she because Darcy's there, she makes sure to include her daughter in all this praise of herself. And then she asks Darcy about his sister Georgiana, and Darcy says that she's a really good musician. And she says, well, let her know that if she wants to be a good musician, she needs to practice. And Darcy's like, well, I don't really need to because she practices all the time. And then Lady Catherine goes into this. It cannot be done too much. That is practice. And when I next write to her, I shall charge her not to neglect it on any account. I often tell young ladies that no excellence in music is to be acquired without constant practice. But of course, she doesn't know anything about it because she's not a musician. I have told Miss Bennet several times that she will never play really well unless she practices more. And though Mrs. Collins has no instrument, she is very welcome, as I have often told her, to come to Rosings every day and play on the pianoforte in Mrs. Jenkinson's room. She would be in nobody's way in that part of the house. So she says Lizzie can come practice in Mrs. Jenkinson's room, and this is the lady who watches over Anne, basically the housekeeper. And she says she will be in nobody's way in that part of the house, even though this is somebody's private room. This person matters so little to Lady Catherine that she doesn't even think about it. She doesn't even consider her to be important enough to even really exist. And Mr. Darcy looked a little ashamed of his aunt's ill breeding and made no answer. So what Jane Austen does quite well in this book is she puts in these tiny little hints that Darcy is not what Lizzie thinks he is. He looks ashamed when Lady Catherine says stuff like this, that's insulting and that kind of puffs herself up. And you see this in a couple of different places, like earlier on, when Miss Bingley and Darcy are walking at Netherfield, and they come across Lizzie, and Miss Bennet said, and Miss Bingley says, "Oh, well, we can't walk along with you because the path isn't wide enough," and that was kind of an insult. And Jane Austen inserted this little look from Darcy that kind of told you that he's embarrassed that she would be so rude to Lizzie. And so she does this throughout the book, just these tiny little hints that Darcy's not the jerk that Lizzie thinks he is. But in any case, that's one of those. And after they talk for a little bit, Colonel Fitzwilliam gets Elizabeth to play the piano for everybody. And so she starts to play, and Lady Catherine listens to about half of it, and then she starts talking again. While Lady Catherine's in the middle of talking to Darcy just walks away from her and goes to the piano and watches Lizzie. And she said, and Elizabeth thinks that he's coming to kind of intimidate her. And we get this little exchange right here. And again, this little conversation gives you a hint at Darcy's feelings. "You mean to frighten me, Mr. Darcy, by coming in all this state to hear me. But I will not be alarmed, though your sister does play so well. There is a stubbornness about me that never can bear to be frightened at the will of others. My courage always rises with every attempt to intimidate me." "I shall not say that you are mistaken," he replied, "because you could not really believe me to entertain any design of alarming you. And I have had the pleasure of your acquaintance long enough to know that you find great enjoyment in occasionally professing opinions which, in fact, are not your own." And so Darcy kind of has her pegged, and he's letting her know that he does. Elizabeth laughed heartily at this picture of herself and said to Colonel Fitzwilliam, "Your cousin will give you a very pretty notion of me and teach you not to believe a word I say. I'm particularly unlucky in meeting with a person so well able to expose my real character in a part of the world where I had hoped to pass myself off with some degree of credit. Indeed, Mr. Darcy, it is very ingenuous in you to mention all that you knew of my disadvantage in Hertfordshire, and give me leave to say, very impolitic too, for it is provoking me to retaliate, and such things may come out as will shock your relations to hear. And so she kind of plays this little game with him about how, like, oh, well, you're exposing me as professing opinions that aren't my own, and now I'm going to expose you. And she tells Colonel Fitzwilliam about that first dance that she met Mr. Darcy at, where Darcy only danced 4 dances, which was, even though there were a lot of ladies who didn't have a partner. And Darcy says, I had not at that time the honor of knowing any lady in the assembly beyond my own party. True, and nobody can ever be introduced in a ballroom. Sarcasm. Well, Colonel Fitzwilliam, what do I play next? My fingers wait your orders. Perhaps, said Darcy, I should have judged better had I sought an introduction, but I am ill qualified to recommend myself to strangers. Shall we ask your cousin the reason of this? Said Elizabeth, still addressing Colonel Fitzwilliam. Shall we ask him why a man of sense and education, and who has lived in the world, is ill qualified to recommend himself to strangers? I can answer your question, said Fitzwilliam, without applying to him. It is because he will not give himself the trouble. I certainly have not the talent which some people possess, said Darcy, of conversing easily with those I have never seen before. I cannot catch their tone of conversation or appear interested in their concerns, as I often see done. My fingers, said Elizabeth, do not move over this instrument in the masterly manner which I see so many women's do. They have not the same force or rapidity, and do not produce the same expression. But then I have always supposed it to be my own fault, because I would not take the trouble of practicing. It is not that I do not believe my fingers as capable as any other woman's of superior execution. Darcy smiled, and said, You are perfectly right. You have employed your time much better. No one admitting to the privilege of hearing you can think anything wanting. We neither of us perform to strangers. And so this exchange is important, because it does kind of show that Lizzie and Darcy, although they kind of have each other pegged, they don't have each other's motivations pegged. And you can see this kind of odd rapport developing between them. Like, it's almost good-natured, but there's still that underlying idea that they don't like each other. And Elizabeth has just decided she's not going to like Darcy. And Darcy's trying not to like Lizzie, because he already does. But again, as I mentioned before, Darcy's main problem is not really his pride. It's that he is introverted. He doesn't know how to talk to people. And speaking as one of those people, I get what he's saying here. I don't have that talent of recommending I don't have that talent of conversing easily with those I have never seen before. I cannot catch their tone of conversation or appear interested in their concerns, as I often see done. He doesn't know how to do it. He can't make himself do it. It's not something, because it feels dishonest to him, because he's introverted. And really, that's the whole problem between Lizzie and Darcy, is he's introverted and she doesn't understand it. And so there's that, and that little conversation, I think, kind of displays that. And it also shows the reader that there's definitely something going on between them beyond them not liking each other. And again, this is the basis of practically every romantic comedy in the world ever since. As they meet each other, they don't like each other, they end up liking each other. That's it. That's where that comes from, is Pride and Prejudice. So, there's that, and the chapter ends, and Lady Catherine, again, tries to find out what they're talking about, because she's got to be part of it. She has to be part of it, and they're talking about Lizzie playing, but she says Anne would have been a delightful performer had her health allowed her to learn. I don't know how in the world a lack of health can keep you from learning how to play the piano, but okay. But in any case, and this is where Elizabeth gets her little popcorn moment to try to figure out what's going on between Darcy and Anne de Bourgh. Elizabeth looked at Darcy to see how cordially he assented to his cousin's praise, but neither at that moment nor at any other could she discern any symptom of love, and from the whole of his behavior to Miss de Bourgh, she derived this comfort for Miss Bingley, that he might have been just as likely to marry her had she been his relation. Lady Catherine continued her remarks on Elizabeth's performance, mixing with them many instructions on execution and taste. Elizabeth received them with all the forbearance of civility, and at the request of the gentleman remained at the instrument till her ladyship's carriage was ready to take them all home. So Lizzie's continues to play, and Lady Catherine continues to tell her what she's doing wrong. But the men don't care. The men just want to hear her play, and so they kind of counteract Lady Catherine's rudeness in a way. Because Colonel Fitzwilliam, both Fitzwilliam and Darcy kind of like Lizzie at this point. So it's kind of interesting there. But that's the end of chapter 8. In chapter 9, Lizzie's by herself at the parsonage. And Charlotte and her sister and Mr. Collins are all out of the house. And here comes Darcy by himself visiting the parsonage. And she's kind of surprised that Darcy's visiting her when nobody else is home. But he says, oh, well, I thought that the other ladies were going to be here too. And whether that's true or not, we don't really ever find out. But in any case, they have this little conversation, and Lizzie finally asked him about Mr. Bingley. And she says, I mean, you know, I heard that Mr. Bingley might not come back to Netherfield, and if that's the case, then maybe he should just give it up. And Darcy says, well, and he's never told me that he's going to give it up, but I wouldn't be surprised if somebody offered him a price for it. He might take it. And they're kind of it's kind of uncomfortable, because Lizzie and Darcy have never really been alone together, and now they got to sit here and think of things to say. It's hard for Lizzie because she doesn't really like him that much, and it's hard for Darcy because he's introverted and he's got a crush on her. And so and he finally makes a comment that Lady Catherine, I believe, did a great deal to the parsonage when Mr. Collins first came to Hunsford. And I like this little bit. She said, I believe she did, and I am sure she could not have bestowed her kindness on a more grateful object. So Lizzie's kind of making fun of Mr. Collins there a little bit. And they continue to talk about Charlotte, and talking about how Charlotte settled within an easy distance of home. And Elizabeth, and this kind of turns a little bit odd, this whole conversation. Darcy says it must be very agreeable to her to be settled within so easy a distance of her own family and friends. An easy distance, do you call it? It is nearly 50 miles, and you got to understand that 50 miles back then on a horse and buggy on dirt roads was not easy. And what is 50 miles of good road? little more than half a day's journey. Yes, I call it a very easy distance. I should never have considered the distance as one of the advantages of the match, cried Elizabeth. I should never have said Mrs. Collins was settled near her family. It is a proof of your own attachment to Hertfordshire. Anything beyond the very neighborhood of Longbourn, I suppose, would appear far. As he spoke, there was a sort of smile, which Elizabeth fancied she understood. He must be supposing her to be thinking of Jane and Netherfield, and she blushed as she answered, I do not mean to say that a woman may not be settled too near her family. The far and the near must be relative, and depend on many varying circumstances. Where there is fortune to make the expense of traveling unimportant, distance becomes no evil. But that is not the case here. Mr. and Mrs. Collins have a comfortable income, but not such a one as will allow of frequent journeys, and I'm persuaded my friend would not call herself near her family under less than half the present distance. Mr. Darcy drew his chair a little towards her, and said, You cannot have a right to such very strong local attachment. You cannot have been always at Longbourn. Elizabeth looked surprised. The gentleman experienced some change of feeling. He drew back his chair, took a newspaper from the table, and glancing over it, said in a colder voice, Are you pleased with Kent? So they're talking about how close Charlotte is to her family. And Elizabeth says, well, it's not really that close, and they don't have a lot of money, so they can't travel a lot. And Darcy says, hey, so this kind of sparks Darcy's interest, because you got to think about, due to what happens in following chapters, you know Darcy's beginning to consider that he might actually want to marry Lizzie. And he's looking for these clues. He's looking for hints of whether or not she might actually say yes. And when they're talking about how close Charlotte is to her family, Darcy says you cannot have a right to such very strong local attachment. It's like you don't seem to be very comfortable in your own family, so maybe you wouldn't mind living far away from them. That's basically what he's saying here. And that is him fishing, finding out whether he's right about that. Okay, and later on, and as all of this continues, we find out, as time kind of goes on, Mr. Darcy comes to the parsonage a lot. By himself, sometimes, and sometimes with people. Why would he come to the parsonage so much? And Charlotte and Lizzie try to figure this out. And why is Mr. Darcy coming to the parsonage so much? He's not coming to see Charlotte. He's coming to see Lizzie. And Colonel Fitzwilliam comes with him a lot too. And I'm sorry. Okay, Mrs. Collins knew not what to make of him. That is Darcy. Colonel Fitzwilliam's occasionally laughing at his stupidity proved that he was generally different, which her own knowledge of him could not have told her. And as she would have liked to believe this changed the effect of love, and the object of that love her friend Eliza, she set herself seriously to work to find it out. She watched him whenever they were at Rosings, and whenever he came to Hunsford, but without much success. He certainly looked at her friend a great deal, but the expression of that look was disputable. It was an earnest, steadfast gaze, but she often doubted whether there were much admiration in it, and sometimes it seemed nothing but absence of mind. She had once or twice suggested to Elizabeth the possibility of his being partial to her, but Elizabeth always laughed at the idea, and Mrs. Collins did not think it right to press the subject, from the danger of raising expectations which might only end in disappointment. for in her opinion it admitted not of a doubt that all her friend's dislike would vanish if she could suppose him to be in her power. In her kind schemes for Elizabeth, she sometimes planned her marrying Colonel Fitzwilliam. He was beyond comparison the pleasantest man. He certainly admired her, and his situation in life was most eligible. But to counterbalance these advantages, Mr. Darcy had considerable patronage in the church, and his cousin could have none at all. So Charlotte's sitting here trying to figure this out for Lizzie. And Charlotte's like, well, it seems to me like Mr. Darcy might like her, but she watches Mr. Darcy and she doesn't really see anything in his face that would suggest that he's really in love with her. But again, this is something that Charlotte doesn't understand, is Darcy's not, as my boyfriend often describes himself as, he's not a basket of sunshine. Darcy is not a high energy dude. He is not a lively, super happy dude. And it's very difficult for people to understand that sometimes. And so I think so just the fact that Darcy's staring at Lizzie all the time, probably for a modern person who understands that there are all these different personality types, would understand that, yeah, he probably likes her. But Charlotte is actually kind of weighing between Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam. So Darcy's a lot richer, and he gives more money to the parsonage. And Fitzwilliam is nicer and more friendly, but he doesn't give any money to the parsonage. And so Charlotte's kind of torn between the two. And that's how chapter 9 ends. And in chapter 10, we kind of start to see more of this. Mr. Darcy keeps showing up. He just keeps showing up at the parsonage, and he even starts showing up along Lizzie's usual walk. And Lizzie actually makes it a point of saying that that was her favorite walk. And she thinks that her telling him this will keep him from showing up. But it has the opposite effect. Now that he knows that that's her favorite place to walk, he shows up there too. And that should be a big old red flag, but poor Lizzie is so deluded at this point by her own dislike of Mr. Darcy that she doesn't see that he wants to be around her. Like, Lizzie has pretty much already decided that Darcy doesn't like her and she doesn't like him. She doesn't have the faintest clue that Darcy has any feelings for her whatsoever. And so that's why she tells him about her favorite walk, thinking that that will keep him away from it. But it does exactly the opposite. And he starts to show up more often. And she said it seemed like willful ill nature or a voluntary penance, for on these occasions it was not merely a few formal inquiries and an awkward pause and then away, but he actually thought it necessary to turn back and walk with her. He never said a great deal, nor did she give herself the trouble of talking or listening much, but it struck her in the course of their third reconnoiter, I cannot say that word well, that he was asking some odd, unconnected questions. And listen to the questions. About her pleasure in being at Hunsford, her love of solitary walks, and her opinion of Mr. and Mrs. Collins's happiness. And that in speaking of Rosings, and her not perfectly understanding the house, he seemed to expect that whenever she came into Kent again, she would be staying there too. His words seemed to imply it. Could he have Colonel Fitzwilliam in his thoughts? She supposed if he meant anything, he must mean an allusion to what might arise in that quarter. It distressed her a little, and she was quite glad to find herself at the gate in the pales opposite the parsonage. So Darcy's asking her these pointed questions. He's asking her whether she likes Hunsford. Okay. Lady Catherine lives in Hunsford. He visits Lady Catherine a lot. Her love of solitary walks. He's noticed that she likes to take these long walks by herself. Maybe he does too. Her opinion of Mr. and Mrs. Collins's happiness, a newly married couple, and whether he thinks they're happy. And also, and speaking of Rosings, he's asking her about Rosings as if the next time she comes to Kent, that's where she's going to stay. If she marries Darcy, then she would be staying at Rosings. But again, Lizzie is so prejudiced against Mr. Darcy and what she thinks her opinion is of him that she thinks he's talking about Colonel Fitzwilliam, because Colonel Fitzwilliam obviously likes her too. But Darcy is asking her these leading questions about and trying to feel her out, because he's already got it in his head what he wants to do. Which in chapter 11, which we will cover the next time, is where all of it comes out. So in any case, he's asking her these leading questions. And she's taking her walk again, and she's going over her letters from Jane, because she's really worried about Jane. Jane's been in London this whole time, and she's getting all these letters from Jane, and Jane is not happy. She can tell that Jane is really unhappy because she's really kind of dejected over the whole Bingley thing, and all of that's heavy in her mind already. And she's walking along, she's looking through her letters, and she hears somebody coming, and she thinks it's going to be Darcy, but it turns out to be Colonel Fitzwilliam. And Colonel Fitzwilliam, and Colonel Fitzwilliam comes along, and they start walking together. And she asks him when they're going to leave, and he says, "Oh, well, I'll leave whenever Darcy says we're going to leave." And that starts this brief conversation about how Mr. Darcy kind of likes to have his own way. And Lizzie says, "And if not able to please himself in the arrangement, he has at least great pleasure in the power of choice. I do not know anybody who seems more to enjoy the power of doing what he likes than Mr. Darcy." "He likes to have his own way very well," replied Colonel Fitzwilliam, and he makes a very good point. "But so we all do." Lizzie's looking at it like he's particularly, like this is a bad thing, but Colonel Fitzwilliam's being honest and saying everybody likes to have their own way. "It is only that he has better means of having it than many others, because he is rich and many others are poor. I speak feelingly. A younger son, you know, must be inured of self-denial and dependence. In my opinion, and this is Lizzie, says, in my opinion, the younger son of an earl can know very little of either. Now, seriously, what have you ever known of self-denial and dependence? When have you been prevented by want of money from going wherever you chose or procuring anything you had a fancy for? These are home questions, and perhaps I cannot say that I have experienced many hardships of that nature. But in matters of greater weight, I may suffer from the want of money. Younger sons cannot marry where they like." And that's a hint to Lizzie. It's like Colonel Fitzwilliam basically saying, if I had my way, I might come after you. And but again, money is a big deal, and But in any case, and Elizabeth senses this. She wonders if that's what he's talking about. She says, is this meant for me? Is what she thinks to herself. And so they kind of go on with this little conversation a little bit. And then they talk about, and the subject of Georgiana Darcy comes up. Lizzie says, I wonder he does not marry, and this is Mr. Darcy, to secure a lasting convenience of that kind, but perhaps his sister does as well for the present, and as she is under his sole care, he may do what he likes with her. And here she finds something interesting out. No, said Colonel Fitzwilliam, that is an advantage which he must divide with me. I am joined with him in the guardianship of Miss Darcy. And he said, and Lizzie says, are you indeed? And pray what sort of guardian do you make? Does your charge give you much trouble? Young ladies of her age are sometimes a little difficult to manage, and if she has the true Darcy spirit, she may like to have her own way. As she spoke, she observed him looking at her earnestly, and the manner in which he immediately asked her why she supposed Miss Darcy likely to give them any uneasiness convinced her that she had somehow or other got pretty near the truth. She directly replied, you need not be frightened. I never heard any harm of her, and I dare say she is one of the most tractable creatures in the world. She is a very great favorite with some ladies of my acquaintance, Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley. I think I have heard you say that you know them. So Lizzie kind of makes this comment. It's like, girls her age sometimes can be hard to manage, so how are you doing with that? And Colonel Fitzwilliam kind of gets a little bit alarmed by this, and so we get a hint now that there may have been some trouble with Miss Darcy in the past. But Lizzie kind of changes the subject to the Bingleys, and this is how she gets to find out something that she suspected already, but now she's got confirmation of it. They have this conversation about Mr. Bingley, and Lizzie says, yeah, I think that Mr. Darcy takes good care of Mr. Bingley. And Fitzwilliam says, yeah, I think he does, and even though he didn't say that it was specifically Mr. Bingley, I did hear, and I kind of think that this is who he's talking about. And Fitzwilliam tells Lizzie that Mr. Darcy was kind of bragging about how he saved a friend from an inconvenient marriage recently. And all of the hints point to Jane. So Fitzwilliam basically tells Lizzie here that Darcy was instrumental in keeping Bingley away from Jane. Now, although she suspected this, she thought that it was mainly Caroline Bingley's doing. Now she hears that it was probably mainly Darcy's doing. And she asked Colonel Fitzwilliam, did Mr. Darcy give you his reasons for this interference? And what Fitzwilliam says, I understood that there were some very strong objections against the lady. And this all kind of bothers Lizzie so much that by the time they get to the parsonage, she's got a headache. And she has to sit by herself and think about all this. And Lizzie, by herself now at the parsonage, said, so to Jane herself, there could be no possible objection. All loveliness and goodness as she is, her understanding excellent, her mind improved, and her manners captivating. Neither could anything be urged against my father, who, though with some peculiarities, has abilities which Mr. Darcy himself need not disdain, and respectability which he will probably never reach. When she thought of her mother, indeed, her confidence gave way a little. But she would not allow that any objections there had material weight with Mr. Darcy, whose pride, she was convinced, would receive a deeper wound from the want of importance in his friends' connections than from their want of sense. And she was quite decided at last that he had been partly governed by this worst kind of pride, and partly by the wish of retaining Mr. Bingley for his sister. And so, and when she sits there and thinks about it, she's like, how could there be any objections to the lady? Jane is this sweet, sweet girl, and how could anybody find her objectionable? And what about my dad? My dad is a brilliant guy, and people respect him all over the country. And yeah, he's kind of weird, but that can't have anything to do with it. Well, my mom, she's kind of an idiot and pretty rude, and I'm afraid everybody knows the kind of person she is, and that might be bad. But then she decides that a lack of sense wouldn't be enough for Darcy to object to somebody. She thinks that it's because of their connections. They're not important. She has uncles in law and business. She's not related to anybody of noble blood like he is. And they don't have a lot of money. So again, this is Elizabeth showing her prejudice. She can't, and everybody's like this, until they get older. When you're younger and you've spent some time away from your family, you can kind of see what other people might think about them. But at the same time, they're your family, and you can't see anything wrong with them. And so Lizzie is kind of struggling with this idea of why Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley's sisters might find Jane objectionable, and so she's prejudiced against him and for her own family and her own sister. And later on, in the next couple of chapters, she begins to see it the way Darcy sees it. And at this point right now, she just can't fathom why. How in the world could her family not be seen as respectable, aside from the fact that we don't have a lot of money and I have uncles who aren't gentlemen. And that's what she thinks Darcy's whole problem is. And that's pretty much how we end chapter 10. Lizzie's got such a bad headache, and this is just setting up the next part. Lizzie's got such a bad headache that she doesn't go to Rosings to see Lady Catherine that night. And so she's staying at home. And in chapter 11, she doesn't stay home by herself for very long. And so that's where we're ending it today.
Fantastic. Mm-hmm. Riveting lesson, Jennifer. Mm-hmm. I appreciate listening to all of it. You can find it on the Noetic app. And we'll be back very soon with installment 10. I don't know. Would you like to say anything else in closing?
Yeah. Well, just again, I just wanted to point out, as far as on a literary level, Austen is absolutely masterful at driving conversations. Like, for instance, Lizzie's conversation with Fitzwilliam and Colonel Fitzwilliam, in which she finds out about Darcy's involvement with Jane and Bingley. You go from the subject of it just flows so naturally from subject to subject, just like real conversations do. Like there's one subject, and then one tiny thing is mentioned, and then that tiny thing turns into the main subject, and then another tiny thing turns into the main subject. That's how conversations naturally flow between people, and Austen does that so beautifully. And speaking as a writer, that is difficult to do. Even though we have conversations all the time, it's hard to capture how a conversation flows naturally when you just got two people speaking. But Austen does it so well, which is another reason why Pride and Prejudice is considered one of the greatest books in the English language. It's because of her mastery in dialogue and character development, and also these little tiny hints of how Darcy's not the jerk that Lizzie thinks he is. It's like that one I pointed out where you can tell he's embarrassed by Lady Catherine's rudeness, and that's not the first time that we've gotten one little sentence that gives you a hint of that. And so the answers are all there. It's just the reader is prejudiced just like Lizzie is until all of this new stuff comes to light, which we will cover the next time. So,
well, thank you again, Jennifer. I will have all the audio and everything uploaded later this evening for those that are anxious to listen on the app. And Jennifer and I will schedule our next session. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thank you.